The knife plunged into Edward Clark's chest with a sickening thud, the sudden violence shattering the quiet of his luxurious home. As he collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide with shock, Sarah stood over him, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. The life of a powerful businessman, a beloved community figure, ended in an instant by the woman who had sworn to love him forever. But as the blood pooled around him, Sarah's heart raced not from fear but from the overwhelming weight of the secret she had kept hidden for so long. Was this murder born of betrayal, or had she simply been pushed too far? The Clark mansion stood in eerie silence, its immaculate exterior betraying the chaos that lurked within. Inside, the grand hallway was a scene from a nightmare. Overturned furniture, a shattered vase with flowers spilling onto the floor, and walls stained with crimson. Nothing about this was ordinary. The grand staircase, which normally echoed with the sound of laughter and conversation, now led to a room consumed by violence. Edward Clark, the well-known businessman and pillar of the community, lay sprawled across the luxurious carpet in a pool of his own blood. His eyes, wide open, seemed to stare into the abyss, a stark contrast to the polished opulence of his home. The knife that had brought his life to a brutal end rested beside him, its blade slick with blood, reflecting the dim light from the chandelier above. The investigators moved carefully around the room, their footsteps heavy in the tense atmosphere. The silence was thick with uncertainty. They exchanged quiet, strained words as they catalogued the crime scene. It was hard to make sense of the horror before them. Detective Marlowe crouched beside the body, his gloved fingers brushing against the blood-stained carpet. No signs of forced entry, he muttered under his breath, surveying the room. This wasn't a robbery. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. Edward Clark wasn't just a successful businessman, he was a man of influence, wealth, and connections. A murder in his home would raise too many questions, but who would want to harm a man like him? As the investigators moved further into the scene, the unease only grew. Something about this murder was off, but no one could yet put their finger on what. The more the investigators uncovered, the more questions they had. Edward's reputation was spotless. A philanthropist, a businessman with connections in all the right places. His personal life, however, was a different story. Rumors of strained relationships, emotional neglect, and whispers about his marriage to Sarah, his wife. But none of that seemed enough to explain the gruesome scene before them. Was this personal? Detective Marlowe asked aloud, more to himself than to his partner. A robbery gone wrong, or a calculated hit? But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear this wasn't a random crime. The brutality of the murder, the way the furniture had been violently moved, this wasn't just a theft gone bad. This was something more deliberate, something personal. The thought gnawed at Marlowe. Could Edward have made enemies so deep that they'd bring him down in such a brutal fashion? His wealth, his status, these were things that should have protected him. But the crime felt intimate. Someone knew him, knew his routines. They knew his vulnerabilities. The mystery deepened, and with it, the sense of dread. Whoever had done this wasn't just a criminal, they were someone with a purpose. The phone rang once, twice, before Sarah Clark's trembling voice cracked through the line. 911, what's your emergency? It's my husband, Sarah sobbed, barely able to breathe through her panic. Her voice shook uncontrollably, the words coming out in a frantic, breathless rush. He's dead. Oh God, I don't know what happened. I found him like this. There was a long pause on the line as the dispatcher tried to calm her, but Sarah's voice only grew more desperate. Please, you have to come. He's gone. I don't. Her words stumbled, nearly choked off by sobs. There's blood everywhere. I think he's been stabbed. Please, come quick. As she spoke, the tremor in her voice revealed something deeper than just fear. There was a flicker of something else, something Sarah couldn't hide. A tightness in her chest, A hesitation before she said anything at all. Her panic was real, but was it genuine? Was it the kind of terror someone would feel in the wake of such a brutal scene, or was it something else entirely? The camera cut to Sarah's tear-streaked face as she stood near Edward's lifeless body, the chaos of the scene reflected in her eyes. Her once beautiful features, usually polished and composed, now twisted with an expression of grief so raw it seemed almost too much to bear. But beneath the surface, there was more to her anguish than met the eye. The detectives watched her closely, their gaze sharp. There was an unmistakable look in her eyes, fear, yes, but something else too. Guilt. Desperation. Or something darker still. Sarah wiped away the tears, her hands trembling as she touched her face. She turned to Detective Marlowe, her voice shaky, a mixture of sorrow and confusion. "I didn't do it," she whispered, almost to herself. "I didn't kill him. I swear." Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. But the way she spoke them, the trembling, the hesitation, suggested she was trying too hard to convince herself. The detectives exchanged a look, but said nothing. I don't know how this happened," Sarah continued, her voice cracking with every word. "He was fine when I left. I don't understand." It was a scene straight out of a crime thriller, but to Marlowe, it was more than that. He could see the cracks in her facade. The way she avoided eye contact. The way her emotions seemed too rehearsed, like she had practiced the story she was telling herself. The desperation in her voice was too convincing to ignore, but her face, the tears and the subtle nervous twitch suggested there was more to the story. As Marlowe stepped closer, he noticed something else, a glint in her eyes, not of fear, but of a secret she was trying to bury beneath layers of grief. Sarah Clark was hiding something. And Marlowe knew it wasn't just her husband's murder that had her on edge. Edward Clark had built an empire from the ground up. A businessman admired by his peers, a philanthropist who gave generously, and a man who wore his success like a shield. His home was a mansion, his clothes tailored to perfection, and his public persona flawless. But behind the polished exterior, his marriage to Sarah was deteriorating. Sarah had once been the picture of grace and devotion. A loving wife, a beautiful woman admired by all who knew her, but now, the cracks in her perfect life were too wide to hide. Edward's coldness had turned their home into a place of loneliness. He had become consumed with work, leaving Sarah to fill the empty hours with shopping trips and quiet evenings spent staring out of windows. Their marriage, once full of hope and promise, had slowly evolved into an arrangement based on duty rather than love. Sarah, deprived of the emotional connection she craved, had begun to feel invisible in a relationship that was meant to be her haven. She sat in the drawing room one evening, the soft glow of a chandelier casting long shadows across her face. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Edward had come home late again, his briefcase in hand, his eyes already clouded with thoughts of the next deal to close. He had no time for her anymore, only for business. "Edward, could you at least talk to me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a quiet desperation. But Edward barely looked up from his papers. "I'm busy, Sarah. I don't have time for this right now." Those words, uttered so casually, stung. They had become all too familiar. As he walked away without another glance, Sarah's chest tightened. She felt more like a ghost in her own home than a wife. Laura Matthews had been Sarah's best friend for years. The two women had once been inseparable, their bond built on shared secrets, dreams, and laughter. Laura was everything Sarah wasn't: confident, outgoing, and always ready to take risks. She had a carefree attitude that Sarah envied, a freedom that seemed so far out of reach in her own life. Laura had always encouraged Sarah to live a little. "You deserve more than this," she would say, her eyes gleaming with a mischievous spark. "You don't need to settle for a life that doesn't make you happy." Sarah had often listened, nodding along, but never truly believing it. She was stuck in a marriage where the passion had faded long ago. Still, there was a small part of her that longed for something more. She had loved Edward once, but now, as she looked at their lives, she realized that love had long since been replaced with apathy. And that's when Laura's words started to make sense. "You know, Sarah," Laura said one evening over dinner, swirling her wine glass idly, "sometimes, you just need to go after what you want. Life's too short to live like this." Laura's casual encouragement, combined with Sarah's growing dissatisfaction, began to chip away at her reservations. She started questioning her marriage more. The idea of seeking out anything to fill the void became more tempting by the day. The first time Sarah kissed James Matthews, she felt a spark, one that she hadn't felt in years. It was brief, almost accidental, a moment of weakness. They had been talking at a party hosted by their mutual friends. James, charming as always, had a way of making her feel seen. He was different from Edward. Where Edward was distant and cold, James was warm, attentive, and full of life. Their lips had barely met, but something shifted inside her. For the first time in a long time, she felt desired. And that feeling, more than anything, was intoxicating. Days passed after that kiss, and Sarah found herself drawn to him more and more. It started innocently enough, a touch on the arm, a shared glance across the room. James was always there, lingering just a little too close, and it felt like fate every time their eyes met. "I can't stop thinking about you," James had confessed one night when they were alone. The words came with such ease, like he had been waiting to say them for a long time. "You deserve to be happy, Sarah. You deserve someone who sees you for who you are." Those words, the sincerity in his eyes, had been the tipping point. She had never realized how much she had been starving for someone to acknowledge her, truly acknowledge her. Edward's neglect had worn her down, but James made her feel alive again. The affair began soon after, a secret wrapped in passion and guilt. Every stolen moment, every whispered word, was both a balm and a poison to Sarah. She was falling deeper, and yet, part of her knew this would lead to destruction. But in the moment, it didn't matter. She was finally alive again. As the affair with James deepened, the tension in Sarah's life reached a boiling point. She found herself living two lives, one with Edward, who remained unaware of her betrayal, and another with James, whose touch filled her with the excitement and passion she had longed for. But guilt was never far behind. Every time she kissed James, every time they made love, she felt a sting of remorse. She was betraying not just her husband, but her best friend, Laura, who had unknowingly encouraged her to take this leap. Sarah's internal conflict grew unbearable. She didn't want to hurt Laura, but she also didn't want to lose the thrill that James brought her. Edward, on the other hand, had begun to sense that something was wrong. His suspicions grew as he noticed Sarah's distracted demeanor, the way she always seemed preoccupied, as if she were somewhere else, somewhere he could never reach. One night, as they sat in the study, Edward put down his newspaper and looked at her. "You've been distant lately," he said quietly, his tone cold. "Is there something going on, Sarah?" Sarah's heart raced. She had never been good at hiding things, and the guilt was eating her alive. But she quickly masked her unease with a forced smile. "I'm just tired, that's all," she lied, hoping he wouldn't see through it. "I have a lot on my mind." But Edward was no fool. The tension between them was palpable, and deep down, he knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how to confront it. As the days passed, Sarah found herself torn between two worlds, one of safety and comfort with Edward, and one of excitement and danger with James. The constant juggling of lies and emotions began to take its toll, but the deeper she fell, the harder it became to turn back. Her betrayal had begun to suffocate her, but in the dark corners of her mind, Sarah couldn't shake the thought that perhaps there was no going back at all. The day had started like any other, With Sarah in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, her hands mechanically moving as she tried to push the overwhelming guilt to the back of her mind. But today, Edward wasn't his usual distant self. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. His brow was furrowed, and there was something in his eyes, a coldness that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "Sarah," Edward began, his voice unnervingly calm, "we need to talk." She froze. His tone, so different from the usual monotone, immediately sent a wave of anxiety through her. He was looking at her, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. She tried to keep her composure, but inside, her heart was pounding. He set down his newspaper with a deliberate motion, his eyes locking onto hers. "Where have you been going every night?" His words were sharp, cutting through the silence. "You're distant, and I can see it. What's going on?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had been waiting for this moment, but she had never expected it to come like this, sudden and sharp, cutting through the walls she had so carefully built. "I've been busy," she said quickly, hoping to hide the tremor in her voice. I just need some time to myself." But Edward wasn't convinced. His eyes darkened, and his next words were heavy with accusation. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. You've been seeing someone else, haven't you?" The words hit her like a slap, more painful than any physical blow could ever be. Her heart dropped into her stomach, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. How did he know? Was it that obvious? "Edward, she started, but he cut her off. "You think I don't notice? I'm not blind. I know something's been off for weeks." His voice, though controlled, trembled with restrained anger. "And don't try to deny it. I saw the texts." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The texts, those late-night exchanges with James. The sweet nothings, the promises, the stolen moments she had tried so hard to bury. All of it now exposed, laid bare before the man who had once been her everything. Edward's face was unreadable, but his voice, now thick with bitterness, cut through the silence. "How long has this been going on, Sarah?" Her mouth went dry. She couldn't look him in the eye. The shame was suffocating her. "Edward, I..." But there were no words to fix this, no excuse that would undo the betrayal. As Edward's voice reverberated in her ears, Sarah stood frozen, the weight of his accusation pulling her into a spiraling vortex of guilt and shame. She wanted to say something, anything, to explain herself, to justify the choices she had made. But how could she? How could she justify giving her heart to another man when her husband had been right there, so close, and yet so far away? Her thoughts raced back to the early days of their marriage, the excitement, the passion. But those moments were long gone. Edward had become a stranger to her, emotionally distant, his attention consumed by his business. She had tried to fill the void with distractions, shopping, friends, a life of luxury, but nothing filled the aching emptiness inside her. And then came James. He had been a breath of fresh air. He had seen her, really seen her, in a way Edward hadn't in years. With James, she had felt alive again, desirable, wanted. Every stolen kiss, every whisper in the dark, had been a desperate attempt to reclaim a piece of herself she had long since lost. But now, standing before Edward, the reality of what she had done hit her like a freight train. She had betrayed him, and not just him, but herself. She had torn apart everything they had built together, and for what? For a fleeting moment of happiness? A temporary escape from the suffocating weight of her own life? "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the confession. "I was lonely, Edward. I just wanted to feel loved again." But her words hung in the air, empty, hollow. She knew they wouldn't change anything. The damage was done. Edward's expression softened for a brief moment, but it was quickly replaced by a look of cold resolve. "How long, Sarah?" He asked, his voice now low, dangerous. How long have you been seeing him? She could feel the guilt consuming her, flooding her chest, making it hard to breathe. She could feel her heart racing, the panic rising in her throat. A few months, she confessed, each word feeling like acid on her tongue. A silence stretched between them. The house, once filled with the sounds of their life together, now felt suffocatingly quiet. Edward stood up, his eyes never leaving hers. You've destroyed everything, Sarah. Do you understand that? Everything we had, gone. His voice broke on the last word, and Sarah flinched at the pain that laced his words. The days that followed were a blur. Sarah was a shell of herself, unable to look anyone in the eye. The weight of Edward's confrontation hung over her like a dark cloud, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at her. But the worst part? It wasn't just the devastation of her marriage, it was the inevitable fallout with Laura. She had always trusted Laura, confided in her, shared everything. Laura had been her best friend, her confidant, the one person she thought she could always rely on. But now Sarah couldn't even face her. She had to tell Laura. It wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the only thing she could do. But every time Sarah thought about the conversation, her chest tightened, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. It wasn't long before Laura showed up at Sarah's door. Her eyes were red, and her face was streaked with tears. There was no need for pleasantries. You're sleeping with my husband, aren't you? Laura's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to cut through Sarah's fragile composure like a knife. Sarah felt her heart stop in her chest. The truth had been exposed, there was no going back. Laura, But Laura wasn't listening. How long, Sarah? How long has this been going on? Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I wouldn't notice the way you look at him? Her voice broke on the last words, and Sarah could see the raw hurt in her eyes, the sense of betrayal that was now etched on her face. I'm so sorry, Sarah murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached out to Laura, but Laura stepped back, shaking her head. You've destroyed everything, Sarah. You've destroyed me, you've destroyed my marriage. And for what? Laura's eyes filled with tears, but there was no sympathy in them, only anger. For a few stolen moments of passion? How could you do this to me? To us? Sarah's heart broke as she watched the woman who had once been her closest friend crumble before her. She wanted to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but the words felt meaningless now. I never meant for this to happen, Sarah whispered again, but the apology was hollow. It didn't matter. The damage had been done. The days after the confrontation were filled with a kind of numbness that Sarah had never experienced before. She barely slept, her mind consumed by guilt and the overwhelming weight of the destruction she had caused. Edward's cold, unrelenting stare haunted her every moment, and Laura's broken heart lay heavily on her conscience. But amid the turmoil, there was one person who seemed to have an unshakable hold on her, James. James had been everything Sarah needed when she felt abandoned, charming, understanding, and constantly there to fill the emotional void that Edward had left behind. He knew exactly how to make her feel special, like she mattered. And as Sarah sank deeper into her sea of regret, James was the anchor, even though he was the one who had helped drag her down in the first place. You're not the villain here, Sarah, James told her one night, his voice smooth like honey. He sat next to her on the couch, his arm draped casually across her shoulders. You've been ignored, neglected. You deserve to be happy. Edward doesn't appreciate you. You're worth so much more. His words were poison wrapped in a velvet ribbon. Sarah's emotional vulnerability was like a wide-open wound, and James knew exactly how to exploit it. He was manipulating her, pushing her further into the abyss. But in the moment, his words were exactly what she needed to hear. She clung to them desperately, as though they were the only thing keeping her afloat. "I just don't know what to do anymore," Sarah admitted, her voice trembling. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling both comforted and trapped. "I've ruined everything. My marriage, my friendship, everything." "You haven't ruined anything," James whispered, his hand gently rubbing her back. "You just need to stop caring about the past. You need to let go of Edward, let go of Laura. It's time to start fresh, Sarah. Time to make your own happiness." His words were like a sweet lullaby, promising salvation. He was encouraging her to break free from the chains of her past, but in reality, he was just tightening them. He wasn't offering freedom, he was offering control. As he pressed a kiss to the top of her head, Sarah felt the stirrings of something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. It was fleeting, but it was there. The hope that maybe, just maybe, she could escape the wreckage of her own making. James had promised her a new beginning, and in that moment, she wanted to believe him more than anything else. The days dragged on, the tension in Sarah's life building to a point where it could no longer be contained. She was caught in a storm, torn between the love she still felt for Edward, the guilt of betraying her best friend, and the suffocating hold that James had on her. And all the while, Edward's behavior became increasingly erratic. His coldness had shifted into something darker, something sharper. He had become like a cornered animal, lashing out at anything that moved. The final confrontation between Sarah and Edward had been inevitable. It had been coming for weeks, like a storm on the horizon. But nothing could have prepared Sarah for the fury that exploded in their living room that evening. Edward stood in the middle of the room, his fists clenched at his sides. His jaw was tight, his face pale with anger. "I've had enough of your lies, Sarah," he yelled, his voice filled with venom. "You think I don't know? You think I haven't seen the way you've been sneaking around behind my back? You've destroyed me. You've destroyed everything we built together." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was no explanation that could undo the damage. No apology that could heal the hurt. "Edward, I never meant," she started, her voice barely a whisper. But Edward cut her off. "No more excuses." He took a step forward, his face twisted in rage. "You betrayed me, Sarah. You betrayed everything we had." He was shouting now, his face inches from hers. She flinched at the fury in his eyes, but instead of backing down, something inside her snapped. The pressure had been building for so long, and now, with Edward's words echoing in her mind, Sarah's emotions boiled over. "You think I wanted this?" she shouted back, her voice breaking. "You think I wanted to feel this way? I've been alone for years, Edward. I've been starving for attention, for love," and her voice cracked, and she stopped herself, suddenly realizing how much of her pain had spilled out. You don't even care anymore." Edward's eyes flared, the anger in them shifting into something darker. "I don't care," he sneered. "Maybe if you hadn't been so wrapped up in your little affair, you'd see that I still care." Sarah's heart raced. The words felt like a slap to the face, and before she even realized what she was doing, her hand shot out, grabbing the knife from the kitchen counter, a knife that had been left carelessly beside the sink just hours earlier. Edward didn't see it coming. One swift motion, and the knife was buried in his chest. For a moment, time stopped. Sarah stood frozen, the blade in her hand, her body trembling. She could hear Edward's ragged breathing, the shock in his eyes as he looked down at the blood blooming from his chest. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. It all happened so fast. The rage, the words, the knife. Everything collided in a single, devastating moment. Edward collapsed to the floor with a sickening thud, his body lying motionless in a pool of blood. The room seemed to close in on Sarah as she stared at him, unable to comprehend what she had just done. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah dropped the knife, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she backed away from his body. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the enormity of her actions hit her like a tidal wave. She had just killed her husband. The house, once filled with the sound of laughter and warmth, now felt like a tomb. Sarah stood in the center of the room, her hands covered in Edward's blood, her mind spinning with disbelief. What had she done? She took a shaky breath, trying to calm herself. The reality of what had just happened was too much to bear. But she had to act quickly. She couldn't afford to make a mistake now. She quickly grabbed a towel, attempting to wipe the blood from her hands, but it was useless. The evidence was all around her. The knife, the blood-soaked carpet, the overturned furniture. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Sarah had killed her husband. She rushed to the phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers, her voice coming out in a strangled sob. "Please, please help, my husband he's dead. He's been stabbed." As she spoke, Sarah's mind raced. She knew the investigation would uncover the truth. She knew she couldn't hide the evidence. But in the panic of the moment, all she could think was that she needed to get away. She needed to escape the nightmare she had created. But even as she made the call, she knew there was no running from this. No escaping the consequences of her actions. Edward was dead. And everything she had once known, the life, the marriage, the family, was gone.